Welcome to the very best part of my broadcast week. This is the Takeout. This week, we're going to talk about a book, a career, and something near and dear to my heart, the essence of good journalism. The book, Collision of Power, Trump, Bezos, and the Washington Post. The career is Marty Baron's career. And of course, the intersection for the two of us is lifetimes spent in journalism. Marty, it's great to have you via Zoom. Congratulations on the book. Look forward to having our conversation. How are you?
Good. Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
So, folks, if you are familiar with this show at all, you know that the Takeout has a pretty stalwart relationship with the Washington Post, past and present. We had a long conversation several years ago with Dorothy Butler Gilliam, a well-regarded journalist, the first African-American journalist at the Washington Post. Carl Bernstein has been on this show. I don't need to say anything about Carl Bernstein, his relationship to the Washington Post. Ben Terrace has been on this show, Craig Whitlock, Karen Attia, Glenn Kessler, and Jason Rezaian. All have flowed through or continue to flow through the Washington Post. Several of them intersect with Marty Baron. So we admire the Post. We take their work seriously because it is serious and solid work. Marty, what is the essence of the role the Washington Post plays and played under your leadership in the nation's capital?
I think our primary role is to keep watch over people in government, people in politics. They have an enormous influence on the lives of ordinary people. And perhaps the highest purpose of journalism is to hold powerful individuals and institutions to account. And that is a role that has traditionally been played by the Post, and one that I wanted to continue when I was its top editor.
And as you well know, Marty, reflexive criticism of the media in general is that accountability journalism is more aggressive when Republicans are in charge than when Democrats are in charge.
Yeah, obviously I've heard that criticism, but the reality is that, the Post was pretty tough on Obama as well. I mean, when they rolled out the Affordable Care Act, it was a total fiasco. The Washington Post was very aggressive in the coverage of that. And very much resented by people in the Obama administration. And for the final 2 years of that administration, we requested, for example, interviews with him, and we were denied that over and over again because they were concerned about the kind of penetrating questions that the Washington Post would ask.
Ladies and gentlemen, just to refresh your memory about Marty Baron. He worked at the Miami Herald, Los Angeles Times, New York Times, went back to the Miami Herald. He was editor there during Elian Gonzalez, a complex cultural, economic, and diplomatic story. He was there for the recount of 2000, a grueling story that went on for weeks, in which the fate of American democracy and the presidency itself was hung in the balance. At the Boston Globe, if you know the movie Spotlight, you know of his role in guiding that newspaper's Pulitzer Prize-winning coverage of a very difficult story to get out in the city of Boston, not just sexual abuse, but the cover-up behind it. And then at the Washington Post, under his leadership, Pulitzer Prizes across the board for, among other things, food stamps, National Security Agency misdeeds or alleged misdeeds, 2016 campaign, Trump charities, and the like. Marty, do you take credit for those Pulitzer Prizes, or do you think that is principally the work of the reporters who did it?
Well, newsrooms, as you know, are collective enterprises. We all work together. Some of the ideas originate with the reporters, and other times ideas originate with the editors. And we work together on that. So in some of those instances, I initiated those stories, but in other instances, they started with the reporters themselves. And in fact, in most instances, they start with reporters themselves. They are the closest to what's happening on the ground. They are the beat reporters. They are talking to people outside of the office. And generally, they are the source for the story ideas.
For those who don't know what a hierarchical relationship is within a newsroom, what is the most important role for an editor in bringing stories like that across the finish line?
Well, first of all, I think it's really important for editors to see patterns in the coverage that perhaps reporters who are most directly involved don't see. So if there's some sort of systemic problem, then it's possible that an editor will ask that question of whether these individual stories might be symptomatic of something that's a bigger problem, a deeper problem. That is, for example, what my role was in our investigation of the Secret Service. We had a number of stories about mishaps in the Secret Service, and I asked our reporter, terrific reporter, Carol Lenig, whether that was emblematic of a systemic problem. She then came forward and said she had heard of additional problems, and so we assigned her to work on that full-time. And she won a Pulitzer for that coverage, which showed real problems within the Secret Service. But of course, we're sort of, editors are also the quality control. We're supposed to ask the tough questions of reporters before publication so that those questions aren't asked after publication. That's what we do, is act as the proxy for the most critical readers we have. And of course, also to inspire ideas at the origin of those stories as well.
And for those who don't know, any large news organization also has a team of lawyers. They run roughshot's too strong a word. I apologize for that, but they are integral to understanding what the libel laws are, what the underlying reporting is, the solidity of that reporting, and you work with them as well, right, Marty?
Yeah, of course. And it's not only a defensive posture they take, obviously, to protect us from potential libel suits and the like, but also on the sort of the offense, really, because there are a lot of government officials these days, particularly at the local and state level, who are keeping information from the public, even though that information under law should be public. And so they're denying that access to that information. And it's really important that we go to court to make sure that the laws are actually enforced and that information that the public is entitled to know, that we have access to that and that we can report on it.
Marty, explain to my audience the role of confidential sources and your attitude about preservation of that confidentiality.
Sure. Well, it's obviously we would greatly prefer to have people always be on the record. You always want that. And of course, many people are willing to go on the record. But in the current environment where people are receiving threats, particularly people who work in government, and certainly during the Trump administration, where if people spoke openly, they were going to be fired, they would be threatened. They would be targeted by allies of the president for both verbal and physical threats, and their lives and the lives of family members would be deeply damaged by disclosure of their names. Even during the Trump administration, even people who went through the normal permitted process, who actually were subpoenaed to testify before Congress and then did honor that subpoena and did testify, they themselves came in for attacks from the president and his allies. And so one can understand why people simply don't want to have their names used. And unfortunately, sometimes that's the only way that we in the press can obtain information.
And one thing I think sometimes people who are critics of the news media misunderstand is that confidentiality is not conferred easily, number one. Number two, whatever is transmitted via confidential source has to be confirmed several ways. We just don't take handouts and grant anonymity as a part of our daily work.
Yeah, and sometimes the public thinks that because people have been granted anonymity, that means we don't know who they are. But
right. We do common misunderstanding, right?
Right. We do know who they are. And during the Trump administration, of course, in many instances, for example, when there were really sensitive leaks, Trump would say that these sources don't exist. And then at the same time, he would say they were launching an investigation to discover the source of the leaks. Those are inconsistent positions. You can't both argue that the sources don't exist, but at the same time, say that we're launching an investigation to find out who those sources are. Those are clearly inconsistent. So we do know who they are. We grant anonymity reluctantly, but frequently, particularly in Washington, it's a necessity. It's also a necessity in a lot of companies as well, because people can't become whistleblowers by having their names out there. And some do, but some don't. Many don't.
That's the voice of Marty Baron. The book title is Collision of Power, Trump, Bezos, and the Washington Post. Stay tuned for segment 2 of The Takeout in just 1 second.
Steve Bannon, early in the administration, said that he described the press as the opposition party. He wants us to behave like the opposition party.
Welcome back to the Takeout. Marty Baron is our special guest. He is living the life of an author right now, but for most of his career, he was not only a formidable, but a Pulitzer Prize winning editor of numerous organizations, most recently the Washington Post, where he was editor from, if I have my dates right, Marty, December 2012 to February 2021. One thing that you are well known in journalistic circles for saying early on in the Trump administration is the quote, which I will read as follows: "We are not at war with the administration. We are at work." What did you mean by that? And does that still hold the same relevance to you in the Post that it did when you first said it?
Yes, I still believe that. And here's what I meant by that. I think we have to think back to why we have an independent and free press in this country, and think back to the origin of the First Amendment. The principal author of that amendment was James Madison. At the time, he talked about freely examining public characters and measures. So let's think through that. Free, we understand. Examining means that we are not just stenographers. We are actually reporters. We are journalists. That means we want to know who is responsible, who is going to be affected, who influenced decisions, all of that. The characters and measures, public characters means the politicians, government officials, the powerful individuals and institutions who influence them. And the measures, of course, are the policies. So that was the first assignment that a free and independent press received in this country, and it remains our assignment. So that is not a war, that is our work.
And it was regarded at the time as a kind of, not bumper sticker, but a philosophical guide for reporters. And I brought it very close to my heart covering the Trump White House at the time, because there was a tremendous amount of emotion about covering the Trump White House. And there were media critics who were saying that the press was normalizing things that were abnormal with Trump and were not as aggressive or critical or aggravated enough in the public space about what it was before it on a day-to-day basis. Jay Rosen often wrote about this, what he considered to be problem with the Washington-based press corps and its orientation to the Trump White House or Trump rhetoric. And I'd like you to explain to my audience the philosophical imperative, not only of saying we are at work, but avoiding the temptation of emotionalism, whether it's Trump or anyone else in the public space.
Sure, I understand the temptation to think that we're at war, especially when the President of the United States says that he is at war with us. And that is what he said on his very first full day in office. He went to the CIA headquarters. He was talking to them, standing in front of a memorial for fallen CIA agents. And what did he choose to talk about? The media. And he said, "We are at war. As you know, I am at war with the media," which suggested that he wanted to enlist CIA agents who worked for him in his war against the media. But my view is that, he may think he's at war with us, and he is at war with us, but we shouldn't take that posture, because, look, just doing our work is what we're all about. I think, Steve Bannon early in the administration said that he described the press as the opposition party. He wants us to behave like the opposition party. We shouldn't oblige him. We shouldn't be the opposition party. And we don't have to be the opposition party, because we're supposed to hold government officials accountable. That was the idea behind the First Amendment, the original idea behind a free and independent press. And that's what we should do. And we should think about it in a professional manner, that this is our task, that this is not a war. If we think it's a war, we will behave in a very different way. And it will not be professional. It will be exactly what Steve Bannon described us as the opposition party, and the public will see it that way. So we have to maintain our independence and just go about our work, which, look, has accomplished a lot. Powerful journalism has accomplished a lot over time. You take a look at, for example, the work that the Washington Post did during Watergate. You look at the work that the New York Times did with the Pentagon Papers. I think of the work that we did at the Boston Globe in covering and disclosing a half-century cover-up by the Catholic Church of sexual abuse within the church. all of those accomplished an enormous amount. That was just work. And so I think we should remember that we don't need to resort to war and shouldn't resort to war in order to fulfill our mission as journalists.
I want to latch on to one of the things you just said there, Marty, which is over time. I have a phrase. It's not nearly as famous as your phrase, but it goes like this: credible journalism will always outlast incredible politicians. But it takes time. It takes time for the credibility of that journalism to be reinforced, to be appreciated, and to stand the test of time, where rhetoric of politicians, particularly aggressively critical rhetoric of politicians, if the journalism is solid, will eventually run out of time.
I totally agree with that. Look, think back to Watergate. Richard Nixon and his first vice president, Spiro Agnew, were targeting the press, claiming that all of the work of the Washington Post and other media outlets was partisan in nature. It turned out that the work of the Washington Post and these other media organizations was validated over time. And the public trust in the media actually rose after Watergate. It didn't decline. It was at its the highest level that we can remember, I think, in our lifetimes. And so, and that's because that work proved to be true. I think it may take more time these days than it did in the past for a variety of reasons. But I think over time, the work will be validated. And that's what we should think about, that long term, as opposed to expecting that our reporting will have instant results.
And yet, Marty, you know that there is a crisis of confidence about journalism in this country. There is a embittered and sort of default mistrust of what we do and how we do it and its efficacy day to day in American life. Is that a solvable problem near term?
Well, I don't know about near term, but it's something that we should start working on near term. I think that we have to do a variety of things. One is that I think we have to cover all corners of our society, all communities, all people with different ideologies, people with different lives. The reality is that there are a lot of people in this country who are struggling, tremendous number of people who are struggling. Their communities have lost industries, they've lost jobs, they're working at jobs that pay less than they did before. There aren't opportunities for their kids. I understand the level of grievance that people have in this country and the feeling that perhaps they're held in contempt by the so-called elites in this country. I understand that they feel condescended to. Understand they feel that they haven't been heard. And I think it's important for us to demonstrate that we are, in fact, listening to them, that we are fully reflecting their lives in our coverage. And that means people in all communities, all communities. But I also think that we need to show our work more. We need to be more transparent about how we obtained the information that we did. What is it based on? I think we should go in with the assumption that people aren't going to believe any word that we write or publish. And so now with the internet, of course, we have the opportunity to show people what we based our work on. If we're writing about a court case, let's show the court ruling, the judge's ruling. Let's show the deposition that we're basing this on. Let's annotate it to show people where we got that language. Let's point people to government databases. Let's point to the video that actually shows what we are talking about, or the audio that shows what we're talking about. There are many opportunities for us to, essentially footnote our entire coverage. And I think that we should be much more energetic in doing that, showing the public and saying, look, you don't believe me? Here, read it for yourself.
We have about a minute left, and we'll carry this into the next conversation on the other side of the break, Marty. But talk to my audience about the struggle within the Post about the word lie.
Sure. Well, look, I think major media organizations initially are very careful with the language that they use. It's not a word that we had customarily used to describe a president of the United States. I think we should be careful. You can never take those words back once you've used them. And of course, at the beginning, we just didn't know whether Trump knew that what he was saying was untrue. Many times he actually is deluding himself into thinking that what he's saying is true. And many times he doesn't even care whether it's true or not. It's not as if he wouldn't even bother to look it up if he had the energy to do so. And so he just extemporaneously just says whatever serves his purpose. So we waited to use that word until we could actually document that he knew that what he was saying was false. And that's when we started to use it. And then, of course, there have been many occasions since then where we could document that.
Many cases indeed. That's the voice of Marty Baron. The book, Collision of Power, Trump, Bezos, and the Washington Post. Stay tuned for segment 3 of the Takeout in just 1 second.
It really annoyed me that people were actually avoiding the word journalism for a long period of time. It was, to me, stunning and dismaying.
Welcome back. Marty Baron is our guest. The book again, Collision of Power, Trump, Bezos, and the Washington Post. Language matters, as you well know, Marty. Precision matters. 2 other words I want to get your interpretation of and how you wrestled with the terms when you were at the Post. Racist and insurrection.
With regard to racist, we actually used that word very shortly after Trump said that people in the so-called squad in the House, that they should go back to the countries where they came from. We didn't use it the first day. That just wasn't our custom to just throw those kinds of words around. I mean, we're not going to throw around words like racist, misogynist, sexist, all of those kinds of things, right and left, homophobic. There are plenty of labels that one could use all the time. But we thought about it the next day. We had a group that came to the conclusion that the language that he was using was in fact racist. And we weren't using it every day, but in that circumstance, we felt that it was justified. So we're careful with it, but we're not averse to using that word when it seems justified. With regard to insurrection, it was clear that what happened on January 6th was an effort to overturn the results of the election. That was clearly its purpose. That's what brought people to a lot of the people to Washington, not everybody, but a lot of people to Washington, and that's what caused them to barge into the Capitol and beat up police officers and talk about hanging the Vice President of the United States. That is the definition of an insurrection. And so we had no hesitation in using that word.
There's something that you write about in the book that I was delighted to see. It's something that I have been frustrated with as far as the industry goes, which is replacing the word journalism with what is regarded by some industry leaders as a synonym, content. They are not the same. I know why they're not the same, but I would like you to explain to my audience why they are so fundamentally different and that the difference matters.
Sure. Look, I think we talked earlier about the difference between stenography and journalism, right? So, I think we need to understand what journalism is. Content has no meaning whatsoever. It just means stuff that you're just putting up on the web or you're putting on the air or anything like that. It's just, and I often joked that we should just substitute the word stuff for it. It is exactly as meaningless as the word stuff. So it really annoyed me that people were actually avoiding the word journalism for a long period of time. It was, to me, stunning and dismaying. So journalism is going deeper. We want to know who is responsible for things that happen. We want to know who is affected by those policies. We would like to know who influenced those policies. Those are the kinds of things that we are looking for. It calls for us going deeper. Examining is what James Madison used the word examining, really looking deeper behind the curtain and underneath the surface. That is journalism, and that is not just content. Content could mean anything, and it's actually generally means nothing at all.
There's also something you talk about in the book, and I'll get to Jeff Bezos in just a second, but the lack of utility of an ombudsman for a newspaper. Lots of newspapers had them. They were kind of the rage in the 90s and the early 2000s. What's wrong with them, and how do they not forward what you talked about earlier, which is this idea of transparency and showing collectively our work?
Sure. Well, I have just an aversion to the idea that only one person should pronounce on the quality of the work that we did. The reality is that in a newsroom, there's as I mentioned before, it's a collective enterprise. We all work together. A lot of people are involved in these decisions. To say that there's one person who's been named to be both investigator, judge, jury, all of that, and this one individual somehow has judgment superior to everybody else. And I don't think the evidence actually shows that that individual necessarily has judged. Sometimes they do, but sometimes they don't. Sometimes they're right, sometimes they're wrong, just like everybody else. So to pronounce this person as being like a high priest of journalism who's going to pronounce on what's quality and what's not quality, I find that just strange. And by the way, we have plenty of critics. So in the time of the internet, we have plenty of critics. We have ombudsmen all over the place.
Yes.
There's no shortage of press critics. And so people can evaluate our work. And I do think we should be transparent about our work. I do think that we should respond to our critics when there are justifiable complaints, which there are. I mean, I think we do need to recognize that we make mistakes. The reason that we make mistakes is because we're human, and all humans make mistakes. So we're not perfect, nor is anybody in any other profession perfect. So we should acknowledge that. We should admit that. We should go about our work with humility. But to say that one person is going to be investigator, judge, and jury, I just don't think that makes any sense.
Many in my audience think they know something about Jeff Bezos. What do they most need to know about Jeff Bezos and his role at the Washington Post?
Well, it's something that I've said all throughout my time at the Post, which and during his tenure, which was more than 7 years of my time at the Post. And that is that he did not interfere in our news coverage in any way. He didn't seek to influence it. He didn't suggest stories. He didn't suppress stories. He didn't critique stories. He didn't do anything of that sort. And he gave us our independence. And he stood behind us at a time when he himself came under enormous pressure from the President of the United States, who sought to sabotage his primary business, Amazon, and obviously the source of Jeff Bezos's enormous wealth. But he stood by us. I know I can think of a lot of business people who would not have done that. When you have the most powerful person in the world, the President of the United States, attacking them daily, demonizing them, and seeking to torpedo their business.
And that's part of the collision. Every editor of the Washington Post collides with every president of the United States, full stop. But this was a collision of a different dimension.
Yeah, I mean, I think it was. First of all, you had the Washington Post, which had a legendary newspaper, which had played a mighty role in the fall of a previous president, Richard Nixon, and so it's and is the preeminent news organization in Washington, and then you had it was acquired by one of the richest people in the world. And then you had Trump, initially a presidential candidate unlike any we'd ever seen before, and then a president unlike any we'd ever seen before. And Trump was first attacking the Washington Post, and because he couldn't influence our coverage, he started to attack our owner, thinking that was his route to changing the nature of the coverage. That didn't work. Bezos stood up to him, didn't bend, didn't break, and I'm grateful for that, for sure.
And when Jeff took over the Post, there was a lot of sense in Washington that the Post had been managing its economic decline for several years before he arrived. He clearly infused the Post with money, but he did not, from the book's orientation to Jeff, spend recklessly. He was a taskmaster. He was someone who encouraged you to innovate, but he wasn't tolerant of waste. True?
Yeah, totally true. He didn't treat us like a charity. We were not his charity. And I'm, glad he didn't, because we needed to use the opportunity of his ownership to create a sustainable business model. I mean, if he treated us like a charity and then someday decided he was no longer interested in that charity, we would have been in deep trouble. So, but he felt that the discipline resulted in greater creativity, that we needed to figure out how to allocate our resources the best way possible. And he didn't spend recklessly in any way. He was willing to invest for the long term, and I think he still is. But he did not treat us like a charity, and I don't think he ever will treat the Post like one. And
the sin of boringness was not acceptable.
Right. It's one of the first things that he said, don't be boring. And I agree with that. it was certainly not a boring period for the media with Trump's arrival on the scene. So we didn't have that many problems with that, but we covered a lot of other things as well. And the issue is how do we cover the news so that we make it engaging to the general public? And we worked hard on that.
That is the voice of Marty Baron. Again, the book, Collision of Power, Trump, Bezos, and the Washington Post. Segment 4, The Takeout, coming your way in just one moment.
The press has an obligation not to just go after the small fry out there, but to actually go after the big institutions.
Welcome back to The Takeout, continuing our conversation with Marty Baron. Marty, at this stage of your career, would you say the Trump years were exhausting or exhilarating?
Well, I guess a bit of both. They were exhilarating in the sense that it was really a call to duty for the press to do our job. I think we faced challenges unlike any we'd ever faced before. A president who was constantly attacking us, who described us as scum, garbage, the lowest form of humanity, and then the lowest form of life itself, and then called us the enemy of the people, and suggesting that just merely the practice of our profession was an act of treason. So we had really never faced that sort of attack, and it wasn't just an occasional attack; it was a constant attack. So it was both a call to duty, but dealing with that all of the time and the threats that it stimulated in the general public, I think was exhausting. We were constantly under attack, not just from Trump, but from a lot of his allies, and our journalists faced threats, both verbal threats and physical threats, which Trump himself essentially encouraged with the language that he was using, and by individually demonizing particular journalists. So it was exhausting in that way. And plus, there was really no rest with him. I mean, it's not like you felt that at any hour of the day you could take off. You could go to dinner or something like that, because at 11 o'clock at night or midnight, he would say something or do something that could be really quite dramatic. And people at times complained that, well, we're covering these things, these tweets, but the tweets were actually an indication of what his policy would be. He was quite open about it. And it's one of the things about Trump, and in many instances, and maybe in most instances, he's totally open about what he intends to do. And we should pay attention to that.
I often told people covering the White House, there was one part of covering the Trump White House that was different than every other presidency I'd covered, which for every other presidency I'd covered, there was this need to try to pull back the curtain and get to what the president was really thinking. That was not a problem with the Trump White House. You knew exactly what he was thinking the moment he thought it.
Exactly.
And that was part of this ever turning gyration of activity at all hours of every day. As you mentioned, Marty, you lived through it. I lived through it. Anyone who covered that White House or covered Congress that was receiving whatever the president was thinking or doing felt it as well. I want to go back to the Boston Globe and Spotlight and that story. What was the hardest part of that story in terms of developing it, reporting it to ground, and then realizing what you had and what you were going to be up against?
Well, very early on, in the reporting, we were able to determine that there were actually quite a large number of priests who had been credibly accused of abuse. But what we really needed to show, and we could have gone straight with that story, but I decided that we should hold back because there was a bigger story that we really needed to document. And that was, well, what did the church do when it became aware of that abuse? It had an institutional responsibility to protect the children in its care. And so it was receiving reports of credible reports of abuse by priests. In fact, with some priests on multiple occasions. So one priest was accused of abusing as many as 80 kids over a long period of time and was transferred from one parish to the next. So the question was not just are there a large number of priests who were credibly accused of abuse, but really the bigger story is, well, what did this institution do about it, and who was responsible for its policies and its practices? And so that's what we were aiming for. That was the more challenging story, and ultimately we were able to document that because we went to court to obtain documents, internal documents of the Archdiocese of Boston that had been kept confidential, that the church itself had requested remain confidential. And we argued that these should be released. And thankfully, a judge agreed with us.
Talk to my audience about the other word that applies in that story, collision, because you're colliding up against not just a global institution of power and renown, but within Boston, among the most influential power structures the city has ever known.
Yeah, well, at the time, I think it was the most powerful institution in all of New England. I would say it's not today, but it was then. And people have asked me frequently, actually, whether I wasn't concerned, about the power of the institution and all of that. And my answer is totally honest, which is, well, that's when we have a greater obligation to investigate. The greater the power of the institution, the greater the opportunity to commit abuse, and the greater the opportunity to cover up that abuse of power. And so the press has an obligation not to just go after the small fry out there, but to actually go after the big institutions and the most powerful individuals and the most powerful institutions. And so that's what we ought to be doing. And so I wasn't concerned about that. I felt that it was our duty.
Did you ever encounter pressure not to?
Well, the church went to court to try to seek penalties against us for even interviewing priests. It argued that we should be prohibited from doing so. It argued that we were violating the terms of a confidentiality order in the court. It was a ridiculous claim, but they tried to suppress it and to threaten us. But we didn't submit to that.
How hard was that decision, Marty, within the newsroom and with your team to not do the first story, but wait until you had the second story, which was the cover up and the institutional disregard for what the church was by any definition required to do, which was care for the children and not allow this to persist?
Well, I think it was hard simply because it's a competitive environment. I'm not sure I would make the same decision today with the internet in terms of the importance of the internet and social media. So we really didn't have social media at the time. Facebook was basically, it was founded in the mid 2000s, 2007, I think it was. But yeah, and people want to go with the story they have. Here you have evidence of lots of priests who have committed abuse. But I was concerned that it would be a numbers game. It wasn't the first time that we knew of priests who had committed abuse. So that had been reported before. There have been books written about that. To what extent were we really contributing to public knowledge? I felt that the more important story was to what extent did the church actually do anything, or did it in fact enable continuing abuse on the part of priests? And the answer is that it covered up solely to protect the reputation of the church, thereby enabling further abuse of priests.
In the moment when those stories were published, did you encounter people who thought you were biased against the Catholic Church reflexively?
We were worried about that. We were concerned that would be the reaction, and we actually alerted our switchboard. We had switchboards in those days, you may remember. I do. It seems so long ago now, but it's not that long ago. We alerted them that people would be calling in and complaining. But the reality is that because we had those church documents, because we put those documents in the paper and on the internet so that people could read them for themselves, they could see there was a sense of betrayal, but it wasn't betrayal by the Boston Globe. It was betrayal by the church. They felt betrayed, and the most devout members of the church felt betrayed because they could see that the cardinal and other high officials within the church said that certain priests would be taken out of ministry, and they weren't. They were just reassigned to another parish where nobody would notice.
That's the definition, ladies and gentlemen, of public service journalism. That's what our conversation has largely been about. Marty Baron has been our guest. Collision of Power, Trump, Bezos, and the Washington Post. Please stay tuned for the Takeout Outtake, especially I will see you next week.
We had metrics at the Post that measured us against our primary competitors on how fast we put out alerts, and the metric was by the second.
Welcome to your Takeout Outtake Especial. Our guest this week, Marty Baron, most recently the editor of the Washington Post, now author of Collision of Power, Trump, Bezos, and the Washington Post. Marty, as we were wrapping up the main show, you said something that I think is really important, that the internet and social media have changed the deadline structure, changed the decision-making process in newsrooms. Walk my audience through that, because I don't think people appreciate the kind of pressures that set of new deadlines imposes on reporters and editors.
Sure. I tell people that our job is not 24/7 these days. It's 24/7 every minute. And there is no rest. And the public really expects now to receive information the instant that it occurs. And there's enormous competition among media outlets to provide that information as quickly as possible. We had metrics at the Post that measured us against our primary competitors on how fast we put out alerts. And the metric was by the second. That is a punishing metric, of course. It puts an enormous amount of pressure on news institutions. And you want to make sure that whatever news you're disseminating is accurate. And to work under that speed is just brutally difficult. And it's hard to verify things that quickly. But that's the environment in which we live today. And of course, there's an enormous amount of competition.
And there is a real tension, Marty, between that clash of immediacy and perfection.
Absolutely. I mean, look, in the past, in the newspaper world,
yes, which I grew up in.
Right. In the newspaper world, we had maybe, a morning newspaper, and sometimes people had an evening newspaper. But in between editions, you had multiple editors who would review stories. You had hours to work on it. People would ask a lot of questions. People would ask you to go back and check one more time or two more times. And so there was the luxury, what we now view as a luxury of time. Well, at the moment, there is no luxury of time. There is no time whatsoever, really, and that is a true conflict, a real challenge to those of us in the media.
You mentioned earlier in our conversation, Marty, I think this is so important, sustainability of journalism. What is, to your mind, a sustainable model for journalism these days?
I think that's very difficult to answer generally for the profession. Obviously, we have a lot of different types of media outlets, and even within the field of legacy, what were newspapers in the past, but are now essentially digital media outlets. It differs from the national news organizations to local ones. But ultimately, we have to provide value to our readers and our viewers. They feel that, in fact, what we are doing every day serves their needs. Our job as media outlets is to give the public the information it needs and deserves to know in order to govern themselves. And we need to think about that both at the local level and the national level. Are we doing that? Are we doing that effectively every single day? Obviously, there are an enormous number of commercial challenges that we face. I can't address them all here.
Right.
There are too many. But I think we need to think hard about our mission, and are we accomplishing that every day? Are we using our resources as effectively as possible? And are we operating as efficiently as we possibly can? We simply have to ask that. I think it's important to remember that newspapers in the old days were essentially monopolies and oligopolies. There were one, two, maybe three newspapers in a city long ago. And many of them earned 40, 50% profit margins. And of course, that's not the case today. Many of them are struggling to make any profit whatsoever, and many aren't making any profit whatsoever. So we need to be more efficient. We need to use technology effectively and efficiently. And we need to be honest with ourselves about the reality of our business and make some very tough decisions about what we continue to do and what we don't continue to do.
I'm going to lighten this up ever so slightly, Marty. I have 3 questions I pose to almost every guest who's ever been on the show. We're going into our 8th year, so take these questions in whichever order you prefer. Most influential book in your life and why? All-time favorite movie and favorite kind of music, either artist or genre.
You should have warned me.
Would be no fun if I warned you.
Yeah, I know. I don't know, most influential. I'm not sure I can answer any of those questions. I'm a big classical music fan,
Okay.
so I'm a little odd duck that way, but I really love classical music. And I like a lot of different ones. Schumann is a big favorite of mine. So As far as influential books, gee, I don't know. Many of the Philip Roth books, I think are just tremendous. I think The Plot Against America comes
Plot
to
Against
mind.
America comes to mind most definitely.
Most currently. So there's a sense of anxiety and worry that builds throughout his novels, and it's something that I think I experience almost every day these days.
And of course, you can say Spotlight for favorite movie.
Oh yes, I forgot favorite movie. Well, Spotlight's an obvious one, so there you go. That should be a shock. That should be a shocker to you.
You get full credit for that one, Marty. You can
Oh,
own that one for the rest of your life. Marty Baron, it's been a great pleasure. Thanks so much for hanging out. We'll see you next week, folks.